Victor Burton here on behalf of the Australian Leadership Project. The Honourable Christopher Pyne, the Australian Minister for Defence Industry and Leader of the House of Representatives, recently joined us to talk about Australian leadership. In the course of the interview, he talked about the leadership of former Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and John Howard. What are the great stories of Australian leadership?
Well, the stories that I guess I focus on are the kind of leadership that I think Australians respect and understand. And the thing to me in the last 20 or 30 years that's been very, very clear in terms of leadership in Australia is that it's unfussy leadership. It's practical leadership. It's not the soaring rhetoric that you get from past history, especially out of Europe or North America. It's more, what do we do that demonstrates our leadership? And I guess in the last 20 to 30 years, the two that really stand out to me are Bob Hawke and John Howard. Obviously two different political parties, but both had very similar approaches to their prime ministerships, which was, how do we change Australia and bring it into the 21st century and out of the well-off, sometimes somnambulant complacency that had marked Australia for 70 or 80 years. Most of Australia had been very similar in terms of public policy from the early 20th century through to the 1970s. It was the Hawke government that decided to make really significant economic decisions that made Australia the country that it is today, supported by the opposition. And then John Howard, in a different way, he ensured that that was locked in, that was cemented in place. So economically, we went from being a successful country to a country that has just enjoyed 26 years of unbroken economic growth, the longest period in the history of the modern world, which puts us in the forefront of great countries. That was leadership. Bob Hawke's around industrial relations reform, economic reform, tax reform, followed up by John Howard that did more on the industrial relations front, undid much of the many decades of agreement between unions and business and government, and tax reform through things like the goods and services tax, getting rid of a whole lot of very inefficient taxes and locking in that economic prosperity that we all enjoy today. That practical leadership that has a much greater impact than a soaring speech, which, while not forgotten, doesn't actually necessarily change the country in which we live.
Well, it's a huge thank you to Christopher Pyne for taking the time to share those insights into Australian leadership. If you'd like to read more about Australian leadership or share your views on Australian leadership, please visit our website www.australianleadership.com. Thank you.